All right, so far we've gone through lesson 1 here. It was 104 pages. It'd be kind of weird for me to say, are there any questions? But hopefully the information that was in there more or less made sense to you. Just so you've got a clue as to what's going on here. I'm going to go over chapter or lesson, whatever you call it, 2 right now. And lesson 2 is on activities and intents. It'll take at least an hour to go through this. We'll take our time. All right, and we'll see where we are then, but possibly today I'm even going to go through chapter 3. And again, that is on the Android Studio debugger. We're going to put the other stuff off, but just so you know what's coming up, lesson 4 is another long lesson. It's 125 pages, but it's on the intricacies of the different widgets. All right. Now, maybe you thought it was unfair. I don't know. When I had you do the one problem with the calculator, and I asked you to go and take a look at, for yourself for the drop down, but I just thought, in some way, sometimes that is the best way to learn things. All right. But we are going to go through this, and then we'll go through this. It's called Delightful User Experience. We'll talk about a few things, some of which aren't even in here. And then you'll notice there'll be testing again. All right. So there'll be some testing today, and there'll be some debugging, or not testing today. There'll be this testing lesson in the future. Either today or tomorrow we'll go over the debugger. And let's face it, testing, as the joke goes, testing isn't sexy. By and large, it's one of those things that you have to do that, if you had your way, no one would ever want to do. And I get it. But there are some really important things in there that I do want to go over with you. All right. So with that said, first, let's go into chapter 2, activities and intents. I'm going to go after this a little bit differently. And what I mean is, I sent you this right before class today. And it's called Android Activity Lifecycle for Dummies. You don't have to bring it up. You can just look on here. You don't have to memorize this stuff. But the key thing is, if you take a look right here, this is pretty much what you've got available to you inside of Android. So you'll notice, as it says, the activity starts. And once the activity starts, the first thing that always gets called is onCreate. Typically, it's only called once. In other situations, it may be called more than once. But as we start to get into intents, and as we start to work with more than one activity, each activity will have their own onCreate. And onCreate historically is what's used to do whatever initialization has to be done. And if you remember, that's pretty much what we have done. We declared our widgets, for example, we declared them at the top of the program so they'd be available everywhere, but we initialized them. We set them up with their find view by ID, etc. That was in the onCreate. All right. So as it says, by default, onCreate is automatically overloaded when you create a new activity. All right, but there are other things that are in here too. I don't want to sit and read to you. All right. Again, if you look right here, we haven't really talked that much about configuring listeners. I showed you how to set up that click listener, another way to set it up. All right. But that's pretty much, what it is right there, the paragraph that I now have in gray. All right. So what else is there? There's onStart. Now the thing is, when you've got onCreate, technically, as it says back here, technically, when you're in the onCreate, your app is not yet running. All right? It's getting ready to run. Notice also in onStart, technically, it's not yet running. All right? Now, unlike onCreate, which is normally, only called once for each activity, onStart can be called a lot of times. All right? And it can be something as simple as, and I've shown you this before, I don't have to pull out my phone, but just taking your phone and going from portrait to landscape, for example. All right? Now, the other stuff that's in there, notice on resume, as it says, here's where the app becomes fully operational. So you can do whatever it is you wanted to do. All right, and it says it remains in this state until something interrupts it. For example, receiving a phone call. All right, starting some kind of a new app or whatever. On pause. says they're in the pause state. Anything initialized in, or initiated rather, in on resume must be paused. Now, the reason that this becomes important is how you write your code, etc. And what I mean is, if you are loading an app and you've got some very intricate, very big or whatever, something that's going to take a while, whether it's a graphic or whether it's something else, and now the phone rings, all right? Then typically you're going to go into a pause state. So what do you want to do in that pause state? All right, that's the thing. In other words, do you want to let the thing keep loading? Do you want to stop it, etc.? All right. As it says, typically if you start an animation and on resume, you would stop it and on pause. But there are some exceptions to that. We'll get into that in just a bit. Then there's on stop. Now, what happens, and you're going to see this when we get into the chapter, is there's something called the backstack. And the reason that that's important is, and you all know this, is, if you bring up an app and the app has got several screens. So if you bring up your whatever app it is, your favorite app of choice, and you bring it up, and you start going from screen to screen, typically there'll be like a back button or something else where you can go backwards. Okay? All right. But as it says there, if you're in the stop state, the activity is no longer visible. All right? But so again, what's important is, what do you want to do right there? You're in a stop state. It hasn't been destroyed though. So it is still up. It is still technically not running, but it still is in a state where it could start running again. Destroy is where you do get rid of it. All right. As it says, it's called when the activity is removed from the activity stack. Now, there's different ways of doing this. All right. Tomorrow, we're going to go back and we're going to rewrite the, at least part of the BMI program from scratch. And if you go, why would we do that? It'll make more sense tomorrow. I don't want to get into it right now. There's a few things that are not discussed in this chapter that I want to go through tomorrow with you. All right. So it says this method will be called after the finish method. Finish literally means get rid of that. All right. Now, when you finish something, you can, by default, it'll get rid of it like that. But you can put timers on it. All right. So what I'd like us to do tomorrow is to rebuild the BMI app. And when we rebuild the BMI app, what we're going to do is we're going to create a brand new main activity. And what that's going to be, and you've heard the term before, was we'll make a splash screen. So in other words, when the program starts to run, something will come up and it'll stay up there for a few seconds. All right. Then it'll immediately go into what our BMI screen is right now. Does that make sense to everybody? All right. And we'll do the same kind of stuff that we did. But we'll have 2 or 3, probably at least 2, maybe 3 other activities. Depends on how much time I have tomorrow morning. My class has got a lab in the morning, and if they ask as few questions as they did today, in fact, now that I think of that, I never stopped that. So that's, did I? Okay, I guess I stopped it. Just want to check, because otherwise I'm still recording in there, and I don't really want to do that. All right, looks like I stopped. All right, so we'll do that, and that'll be our main activity. It won't be technically main activity, because the splash screen is technically the main activity, because that's what starts the app. So we'll go from some kind of a splash screen into main activity. We'll add a couple more buttons, and we will pass things on to those buttons. So in other words, when we want to provide the information about the person, because we haven't done this yet, one thing that we'll do tomorrow is we will also go in and we'll add an image view, all right, on a new screen. So if the person is obese, we'll get a picture of an obese, either a picture of an obese person, or you can do a caricature or whatever. I mean, I've got some, I could show them to you right now, okay? And basically, they're not headshots, they're just body shots. All right, so we'll do something like that. We'll also have another activity where we will present all of the final totals. So in other words, if you want to see how many people you did that did this, how many people you did that did this, etc. My hope is, and I've never done this before, but I don't see why it'd be that difficult, is eventually we will take that information, and I don't know if we'll put it in a database or we'll do what, but we'll bring it in with a recycler view So again, you'll have a whole bunch of people that'll be in there. You'll have a picture of them, a little picture, a height and a weight, and a BMI. So it'd be something you could use, for example, like in a gym. Okay? All right, so that said, let me just jump into the chapter. So as you can see, activities and intents. All right, and I mentioned that basically you can look at an activity as being a screen, and that's what they say in here too. They'll give you some examples in here, but really, other than what we've done so far, most of the time when you create an app, it will have more than one activity to it. All right? And tomorrow when we go through this, I'm going to do it slowly, all right, but I still think we can probably do it in a couple hours or so. But I want you to keep track of what we're doing and ask if you have questions. Why? Because when you create your final project, I'll expect that you will have a splash screen for it on whatever that happens to be. All right? So they give an example here, and they say how, for example, if you've got an app running and it might have access to your camera, to email, or whatever, that's totally fine. Again, typically one activity in an app is specified as the main activity, and usually that's what it is. That's usually, forgetting splash screen for a second, that's usually kind of your point of entry, so to speak, for the program. Again, even if you do have a splash screen, there typically is a main screen that you're going to have, at least in most apps. All right? So it says each time a new activity starts, the previous activity is stopped, but the system preserves the activity in what's called the backstack. So again, if you want to hit your back button, it'll bring you back there. All right? Now, the reason I brought that up, and I showed you that article and just spent a couple minutes on, notice as it says here, just on the top of page 3, when an activity is stopped because a new activity starts, the first one is notified by a callback. Okay, fine. The activity life cycle is what makes this whole thing happen. You'll see a picture very similar to the one I just showed you in here. All right? And they will also go through very much the same stuff I just went through with you. All right? So, how do you create a new activity? Well, if I come in here and let's just say I make a new project, and it'll be an empty activity, and I'm just going to call this test app. Kind of a dumb name, but it'll work. All right. And I let it spin for a couple minutes. You know the drill. That eventually it will come up and it will show me some stuff. All right. I'm going to come back to that then. Or let's see how fast this loads. So right now, again, public class, main activity. Nothing new there. They are going to go back in there and they're going to explain in just a minute what some of this stuff in here is. Because we haven't really talked about onCreate and super onCreate and saved instance, etc. very much. We're going to take a look at in a minute. But if you look right here, if I take my mouse and I click on the name of my package, edu.rankin.jpscott.testapp, and I right mouse click, then I can do new, and one of the things that's in here is activity. So I can go to activity. If I go to the gallery, that should look familiar to you. All right, it's the same exact gallery, so you can do it from there. Or I can just right mouse click and again do a new, go down to activity, and if I want another empty activity, there it is. Now, when you do this, it's a little bit different in that, notice it's called main activity 2. You don't ever want to use that name. But again, it's always recommended that you end it with the word activity. So if I come in here and I don't want this to be main activity, let's just say I want to call this, I don't know, totals activity. Then notice it's automatically activity underscore totals. All right? When you are making pages that, for lack of better words, are subordinate to your main page, where it says their launcher activity, don't ever click that. All right, that means that you're able to launch the program through that. You don't want to do that. All right? And again, end it with activity, and then it should be activity underscore, and then whatever you called it. All right? And you'll notice what else is in there, the package name and the language. You can mix and match. In other words, it's not done often, I don't think, but you can have a Kotlin page in an Android app, a Java Android app, and vice versa, if you need to do that for some reason. And if I click right here and I click finish, what do you notice? Well, this looks pretty much the same up on top. All right, the import statements that are in here, they're the same. What's different is right here. That's really the only thing different between these two files. Is since they're two different activities, it's the name of the class that represents the activity. All right, and you'll notice if you look up here right now, I've got two activities. All right, and what most of the rest of this chapter is about is how you can go from one to the other. All right, so it says to implement an activity. It's what I just did. All right, now where it becomes a little bit more difficult, as you'd imagine, it's not that hard to go from one screen to another screen. It really and truly isn't. We'll look at that in just a bit. But what gets to be a little bit, or can be a little bit problematic, is when you want to pass information from one screen to another, and possibly also maybe even pass information back again to the original screen. So we're going to talk about all that in just a second. All right, so next here, middle to bottom of page 3. If you don't have to read it, but what they're saying in here is the reason that you have this right here, that is so that as much as possible you can be compatible with older versions of Android. And why is that important? Because you never know what version of Android somebody, if you create your own app, somebody might be using to try to run your app. So this does everything it can, basically, to make sure, as much as possible, to make sure that if you're using an older version, that as much as it can, it recognizes everything in your program. Now, we talked about this before. You know what public is. All right. You know what the word class is. All right. We talked about main activity. So again, this says this right here. The word extends. You know that too. All right. It's inherited from app compat activity. All right. It's automatically overridden, and notice protected, void, on create, bundle, saved instance. Well, let's talk about that. Of course, void meaning it doesn't return anything. On creates the name of the method. Protected, which means that it can, anything that is a child of it can actually change whatever is in here, but this is new. All right. Everything that you're working on in a project gets basically put together in what's called a bundle. All right? And what they're saying here is that this saved instance state is going to kind of take a snapshot, for lack of better words, all right, and remember everything where you currently are. What this is doing right here, and this is really important, this line, we talked before about the communication that has to take place between your XML file and your Java file. That's kind of what it's doing right there. The set content view, for lack of better words, is it's telling it to go out to your XML file, all right, and look at all the stuff that's been defined out there, and now bring it into the program. Now, that there's more to it than that. I mean, we've already looked at some of this where you have to, so if you've got an edit text, you've got to define edit text in here and refer to it, but that's the whole thing. What I'm giving you here, good, bad, or indifferent, is I don't want to read to you. So that's what they're saying in here. All right? So you take a look at that. If you don't like what I said, or you don't agree with, if they don't totally agree with it or whatever. So you typically define the UI in one or more XML layout files. So far, we've only used one. All right? We may have occasion to use more than one. We'll talk about that later. All right. Kind of a key word, so to speak, right here. It says you typically define the UI in one or more XML files. When the set content method is called with the path to the layout file, it creates all of the initial views. Everything, all of your widgets are your views. So each widget is a view. All right. The activity itself basically is a view. This is called, as it says, inflating the layout. So whenever they basically go and they create something where you have to put something onto a screen or whatever, it's called inflating it. You're going to see the word inflating in more than one case. All right. Now, it talks about the on pause here. I've mentioned it to you already. Okay. Okay. Implement the activities UI. The good news is that a lot of this stuff that you used to have to manually go in and change or add is now added for you. What do you mean, Jeff? All right, I'm going to go in here. You've already seen this. It doesn't matter which screen I'm on here. I can go back to the main one. It doesn't matter. But if I go into my manifests file, can everybody see that? Okay, or figure out where I am. And if I go to the Android manifest file and open that up, all right. Now, if you look in here, there are two things that are in here. There's main activity and there's totals activity. See that? All right. It used to be you had to manually go in there and put that stuff in yourself. Now you don't anymore. That stuff is set up for you. And basically, the reason that that's important is when you start coming in here and you create like these intent filters, etc. here, it is possible for you to put more information in there than what you currently see. You can put in things like categories. You're going to see all that in the chapter here. All right? Here we go. All right. So this is what I just mentioned about declaring the activity in the Android manifest.xml file. It's basically done for you. All right, so they have you come in and add another activity. It's what I just showed you. All right, it was file, new, activity. And if you choose the gallery again, you see all of them. Or you can just choose any one. It doesn't matter which way you do it. All right, so again, as mentioned here, when you choose an activity template, all right, it says Android Studio provides 3 things for each new activity. It's what I just mentioned. It gives you a Java file. So if we look up on the screen here, what you'll notice is I've got the Java file. All right. And what else should be here? There's my activity main. All right, right there. But look, there's my activity total. Right now, they look virtually the same because I don't have anything in either one of them. All right. One of the things that we're going to do tomorrow, too, and it's not that big a thing, but we're going to start talking a little bit about color and about style. All right. Why? Just because we want to make an app that looks decent. All right. Now, when we get done with this tomorrow, you might look at it and go, well, you know, what you think is decent, what I think is decent are two different things. And I get that. All right. If you are going out and you're creating your final project, and this is something you're going to try to put out on the App Store, and your favorite color is pink, and you want a pink or a hot pink background, then go for it. All right. But what I'm going to start doing, and you'll see this when you get your next homework assignment, is I'm going to give you some requirements, but they're going to be more and more as we go on. They're going to be vague. All right. I'll tell you what it is you have to do, but I'm not going to tell you how to do it, and I'm not going to tell you what it should look like. Because I want each one of yours to be an extension of you. All right? And I've said this kind of thing to you before, but just imagine all 5 of you were applying for the same job. All right? And it turned out, you know, that you all put in your portfolio, and when it was, let's just say it was an Android developer job, and okay, you all decided to have the same projects. If they all look the same, that, in my opinion, that'd be a poor reflection on me. Not so much on you, but it'd be on me. That'd be me saying, hey, make it like this, make it look like this, and make it act like this. That's not what I want you to do. All right. So as it says, we got the Java file for that new activity. So we got an activity main Java file. We got the XML file, and we got the stuff added to our manifest file. Okay, that's all fine and dandy. But the key thing, again, is this intense thing. All right, I'm going to show you the examples, but we're going to do it together tomorrow. And the reason that I'm going to wait, we're going to do it together tomorrow is twofold. First of all, The program that I had written over a year ago that I wanted to use to show it to you, it's giving me a build error. Even when I went into Gradle and tried to fix it, so I'm going to have to go back and try to rebuild or redo the thing to get it to work. All right, the other thing is I want to give it its due diligence. In other words, I want to take enough time. And I think I told you, I don't want to go more than 1:30 to 2 o'clock on these lectures because I want you to have plenty of time to work on the homework. I did notice on the homework, if you look up on the screen here, where is it? Your first homework. No, it'll be the next one. That's wrong too. Where is it? There it is. What I had put here originally was it's due Friday 1/18. Well, 1/18's gone and it's passed. So if you have it in by this Friday, that's fine. I'm going to grade it this weekend. That makes sense? All right. And probably I'm going to grade it, unless my wife has other plans, on Saturday morning. And the reason for that is either Saturday morning or Saturday afternoon. Because if Green Bay plays on Saturday evening, and if they lose, you don't want me to grade it on Sunday. All right? So I'd rather get it done then. So I'm going to try to grade as much for both classes as I can in that time. But again, as long as you have it in by Friday, all right? Now, I'd prefer it, if you can, to have one, just, either one or two repos. If you can put it all in one and call it like something like your last name dash AWD1112, that'd be great. Or your last name dash AWD1112 HOTS in another one for AWD, your last name dash AWD1112 homeworks or something like that. Yeah, I can't believe I was so foolish to not tell people to put their last name on their repos. I'm having the people in the morning class do it. It's so much faster for me to find things than it's ever been. All right, it's not that big a thing. There's 5 of you. There's 8 of them, and out of the 8, one person has never shown, other than day 1. He showed to tell me his mic didn't work, and then I haven't seen or heard from him since then. All right. Okay. So what intents are is they allow you to pass information from one activity to the other. So imagine again we've got 2 activities, activity 1 and activity 2. And I can set up a button in activity 1 so that when I click it, it can take information from activity 1 and pass it over to activity 2. I can also do it in reverse, so I can pass information both ways. All right? So as it says, each activity is started or activated with an intent. What that means is, even if you're not passing anything from one screen to another screen, you still need to create what's called an intent. And what you'll see in just a second is intents can be explicit or they can be implicit. It's on the bottom of the page here on page 6. If you remember, because I gave you this shtick a long time ago in the AWD1000 class, if something is explicit, you do it. If something is implicit, basically the software does it. All right? And so who cares? Why is this that big a thing? Well, most of the stuff that you're going to do, probably most of the stuff in your apps, if everything that you're doing in your app is going to be self-contained, in other words, if you're not going out to the internet to call some web page or do something like that, if everything you're going to do is in your project, virtually everything you'll do should be explicit. All right? If you're not doing it that way, if you're calling out something in the internet or whatever, or maybe you create your own, James here is going to create his own Spotify. All right, he's going to, and what'll happen is, it's not really Spotify, but what'll happen is, if you bring up some kind of a music type of file, it'll give you a list and say, what do you want to open it in? And it'll give you 3 or 4 different things. That makes sense? That's when you'd use typically an implicit intent, where the user would have the opportunity to ferret through and search from a list. And you're going to see that in just a couple of minutes. All right. Again, not only do you use the intent to go from one to another, but as they say right here in the blue, as you can see, in addition to starting an activity, an intent can also be used to pass data from one activity to another. Now think about this. Let's imagine, like I said, for just a second, let me just kind of dummy this up. So, it's tomorrow. I'm going to make this nice and big. All right. And we've got our BMI program. Make it even bigger. That should be plenty big. So you've got our BMI program. All right. And I'm not going to, so we have a splash screen. Now, what's that going to have in it? That's up to you. All right. In other words, as an example, and I went and looked right before class. So I didn't have a great amount of time to look, but I found this. I wish the wordage was a little clearer, but if you look, okay, there are all sorts of pictures out there. You can type in BMI calculator. You can type in BMI. I just went out to Google Images. All right. But it would be nice if on your front page, okay, you would have, maybe a heading, BMI calculator, and then some kind of an image. All right? Then, however you do this next would be up to you, but as an example, you might have a toast come up that has written by and it has your name on it, as an example, or something like that. Version 1, written by, whatever it is that it happens to be. All right, so we've got that. We've got a splash screen, and that calls, for lack of better words, our main activity. And what happens in main activity? Well, it's going to figure out the stuff we talked about before. It's going to figure out what the BMI is, and it's going to figure out the BMI status. All right? So again, you already know this. If somebody's BMI is 35, they're considered obese. All right? So how do we want to handle that? Well, we could show all the information on the screen, right there, but once we start adding more buttons and the like, what's going to happen is it's really hard to see everything, period. You only have, again, a limited amount of real estate, especially if you're using a phone. So let's just say we'll just call this individual activity. So we've got main activity, and main activity calls this individual activity. All right, and to do that, it's going to have to pass in, let's just say, the height, the weight, the BMI, and the status. All right, and maybe that page right there is just going to give you everything on there, but it'll all be textual. You with me? It'll be textual. All right. Well, maybe also we'll have it where main activity can also call, we'll just, for lack of better words, I'm just making this stuff up. All right. It calls image activity. So rather than showing you all that stuff, maybe the only thing that image activity needs is the status. And that's where you're going to show a picture of a person who's either, underweight, overweight, etc. So that's already right there. That's 4 screens. Does that make sense? All right. Then we also have where main activity calls, let me get rid of those. Totals activity. And that'll be your total underweight. Just imagine I kept typing. Total optimal weight, total overweight. Does all that make sense? Now in this case, because I don't want to get too heavily into it, but right now, as I said, we'll have 4 or 5 screens right there, 4 or 5 activities. But all of our passing that we're going to do is going to be done one way. All right? So that's similar to the type of thing that we're going to create tomorrow, just so you know that. All right. Again, explicit, as it says, you specify the receiving activity using the activity's fully qualified class name. What does that mean? It means it's the syntax to use this is kind of ugly, for lack of better words. All right? Then there's an implicit activity where, as it says, you give a general action to perform, and then you let the system figure it out. Again, that's the difference between implicit and explicit that we've already talked about. All right. So, much of the talk that's in here is going to talk about explicit intents. There's not going to be that much in this chapter on implicit. So if you look in here, it says the key fields are the following. All right, the activity class that you want to call, and notice how you do this. You give it your package name dot the name of the activity dot class. Looks a little funky, all right, but it has to basically know, all right, exactly what it is you're doing. The intent data. When you pass the data, good, bad, or indifferent, there's two ways you can pass the data. We're going to look at those in just a moment. And it is, are you passing a single piece of data, or are you passing multiple pieces of data? All right, we're going to look at that in just a second. Typically, you're going to pass multiple pieces, so those multiple pieces are called extras. Now, we talked about getters, and setters, all right? But now there's going to be get extras, and there's not going to be set extras, but there'll be put extras. All right, you'll see those as we go on. But as it says, these are key value pairs. What does that mean? The name of the key you make up. All right? So, I mean, like, for example, if I'm going to pass a height, a good name for the key would be height. You could use H, but you really should use names that make sense, so that if you write something and possibly later someone else ends up going in and doing some maintenance work on it, that they have a clue as to what you're doing. All right? Also, as it says, you can use what are called flags. As it says, it may instruct the Android system on how to launch an activity or how to treat it after it's been launched. So, kind of hard to see, but hopefully you can either on mine or bring up your own. See if I can grab that and copy it. That's as big as I can make it. Hopefully you can see that okay. Now, nothing wrong with calling this thing message intent. I will tell you that virtually all the time when you are creating intents, all right, in your work, you'll see it like this. In other words, it's type intent, and you'll just call it intent. All right? So what are we doing? We're instantiating a new intent right here. This right here, no pun intended, the word this is what's referred to as the context of the intent. This should work virtually 100% of the time. This right here is the name of the activity you want to call dot class. All right, so this is saying, and typically this is going to be hooked up to something like a buttons click event. All right, that when you click it, this is what you're going to want to have happen. You're going to want that page to come up. Now, to do this, you do this. You say start activity, and you give it the name of the intent. So if I changed mine to just the word intent, you do it like that. Now, I'm not even going to ask because it may or may not make sense, but if we do it tomorrow a couple times, it probably will make a lot of sense to you. All right? It's fairly intuitive as far as the way that you do it. All right. And again, as it says, these are the two things that are in there, the word this and the show activity. The first is the context. And if you say, like, what is context? You can look it up yourselves. The problem is there are so many definitions, etc., out there that when you start to read it, you get more confused. All right? It's basically, I look at it as kind of like what's active, all right, etc., kind of thing. All right, then as it says, you need the component you want to start. All right? It says use the start activity method with the new intent object as the only argument. Start activity sends the intent to the Android system, which does a couple things. It's got to tell it to stop the activity that's currently running, and it's got to tell it to start the new activity. Does that make sense, looking at it through the way of the life cycle? All right. And I'm being general or generic here, but there's more of a description than what I'm giving you inside of here. All right. Now, it says that when you want to go from one screen to the other, So if you want to go back again, so if I've gone from my main screen, let's say, to my total screen, okay, I can click the back button and I'll go back to my main screen again. There's also a thing that you can put in here that's called finish. It says you can manually close any started activity in response to a user action such as a button click with the finish method. And that's fine and dandy, except it doesn't always work. All right, and other people may disagree with that. No, mine always works. I've put it in there and it's worked. I've run it again later and it worked just fine, and all of a sudden it doesn't work. All right? So, passing data from one activity to the other. We started to get into this. All right? It says, in addition to simply starting it, typically you'll want to pass information to it. Now, probably the only time that you won't want to pass any information is, for lack of better words, if you've got dumb activities. For instance, let's say here that, don't ask me why, this is just the example that popped into my head. In my main activity, I've got 3 buttons. I'm going to call it the All-American activity. And if you press the red one, it goes to a new screen that's red. If you press the blue one, or the white one, it goes to a new screen that's white. And if you press the blue one, it goes to a new screen that's blue. Probably I wouldn't have to pass anything in there. All right. But if your program has got anything where it's working with data, and that data needs to be known, for lack of better words, kind of application-wide, sooner or later you're going to be passing data one way or both ways. All right? So it says the intent object you use to start an activity can include intent data or intent extras. What's the difference? Data is one piece of information. It's actually more than that, but technically it's considered one piece of information. And notice what it says, the URI of an object to act on. What's a URI? Well, you know what a URL is, the Uniform Resource Locator. All right, the URI is the Uniform Resource, what is it? It's indicator, one is locator, I think one is indicator. A URL is a subset of a URI. The big difference between a URI, in my opinion, and a URL is a URL must exist. A URI can be out in cyberspace someplace and technically not even exist. So you can give it a mythical address or whatever, usually. All right, so as it says, in order to be able to pass this information in the sending activity, you need to create the intent object. You already saw that. What's new is you need to put data or extras into that intent and then do your start activity. So in other words, what we already have here is we've got 2 of the 3 pieces. All right? So right now this would send nothing in its current format. In the receiving activity, it says you've got to get the intent object and you've got to retrieve the data. Well, that shouldn't be a big surprise to you. So it's when to use intent data and when to use intent extras. All right? So notice the URI, as it says, could be a web page, it could be a phone number, but basically it is a piece of information. So if you have something very simple that you want to pass and it's only one thing, then typically you use data. Now, even if it's only one piece of information, even if it's just one thing, you don't have to use data. You can still use extras, even with one piece of information. That's typically what I do. All right? I just find it easier to do that. Now, you may or may not agree with that. So, and it says extras are for other arbitrary data that you want to pass to the starting activity. Notice it says, by default, they're stored in what's called a bundle. All right? And they're stored as key object pairs. You don't have to worry, but they give you a little bit of other information basically on how these bundles are set up if you want to read that. So whereas it says you should use the data when you only have one piece of information and when that information can be represented by a uniform resource indicator, but you use extras if you want to pass more than one piece or if any of them that you want to pass is not expressible by a URI. So unless you're pointing from your, let's say from your app to another web page or something like that, or a phone number, where you can call a business, you're probably going to be using the extras almost all the time. All right. So, adding data. This is kind of ugly, all right? And in fact, the one they're showing here is the set data. So if we looked at this one, I'm going to grab this right here. So they're bringing that into it. Whoop, let me get back to the beginning. All right, so there's the piece of data that you're passing. And you'll notice it is case sensitive too, as far as where it's URI.parse. All right. So that would pass that web page. In other words, if you wanted to be able to go to Google from where you currently were, that would be a way to do it. All right. Oops. Adding extras to an intent, already mentioned this a little bit, but it's a little bit more complex of an operation. All right, so notice what it says. Determine the keys to use for the information you want to put in there, all right, or define your own. Well, unless they're already been defined, you're typically going to define your own. Even if I've got a variable that's named height already in my program, I'm going to define the key as height. So my key name and my value name will be the same. The difference is the key name is the string HEIGHT. The value will actually be that person's height. All right? And when you start doing that, there's other things that you can do, and I think some of them are mentioned in here, such as you can set default values. So if you try to pass something and it doesn't work, you can give it a default value. Make sense? All right? So for example, a lot of times with strings, just in case you have a problem with it, you set the default value as the empty string. So the program doesn't break or doesn't try to sit there and hang up waiting for something. All right, we've talked a little bit about, and we even use this in the context rather of Java, of setting default heights, default weights, etc. So you could do the same kind of thing. Now, what they're doing here, okay, is I'm going to grab their example even though I don't like it. All right, so I'm going to grab this, and I'm going to put it in here. All right, so public static string, x equals this. Okay, that's fine. And I used x, okay. Not trying to waste your time or my time, but what I'm trying to show you is, if you look here, so let's just suppose that you'd already inputted a person's height. Everybody with me? So you already have inputted the height. Then what you're typically going to do is it's not going to look like this. It'll probably be an int. So notice it's put int. All right. So it will probably look more like this: height, height, just like that. Now, what does that mean? Well, one thing that it means is on the other end, if you want to be able to use it, you've got to know the type that it is. And again, typically, I believe so if I wanted to give it a default value of, like, just say 72, we'd do it like that. All right? So after you populated the bundle, it says add it to the intent with the put extras. Okay, so we have to do this. So again, let's just take a look at, hopefully at least, a fairly realistic example here. So we'd have a put int for height. We'd have a put int for weight. And I believe the one for a string is put string, but we're going to find out if I'm wrong. So let's just say here, So if you look up on the screen here, I want to make sure that what I'm showing you is making some sense to you. This is creating the new intent right here that we're just calling intent. We're saying that when you click the button or whatever this is connected to, you're going to want to call this activity. All right? We are adding, and so we are passing to that activity two integers, one representing a weight, one representing a height. Even though they're already called height and weight, it's okay to give them the same name. I could give them totally different names too. And I've given them default values. Also, we're doing a put string where we're passing the status and we're defaulting it to the empty string. After we do that, we take all those extras like that and we do a put extras. That's what's bundling them up. All right? And then we call the start activity, and that's going to send them. Does what we're doing here, does it make sense? Because that's what we're going to do tomorrow. All right? All right. Now, if you want to get the data back from an activity, so in other words, if I'm going to pass something, but I want something back, then notice I don't do a start activity. I do what's called a start activity for result. Okay? So just doing a start activity assumes you're not going to have anything passed back. Not that you're not passing anything, you're not going to receive anything back from what you passed to. If you want to receive something back, then you go through the same process, but rather than this, you've got, instead of a start activity, it's a start activity for result. And then notice a requested code. We're going to see those codes in just a second. All right? All right, so it says to get data back from a launched activity, start that activity with a start for result instead of start activity. Yeah, they show that. All right, and other than that, it's going to look similar to what we just did. All right, I don't want to go that much into it right now, and I don't think, I think that if we're just going to be pushing it out from our main activity to other ones, we'll be okay for now. All right. Now, when you return stuff, they said there's a code, and if you look on the bottom here, page 11, this is what you can do. So you can check, for example, for result _ OK. That means the request was successful. You asked for something to be sent back, and it was. You can have canceled. Maybe it's just taking a long time, or nothing's happening. Okay, and as it says, first user, where you can define your own codes if there's something special that was going to happen in there. All right. I'm not going to go into any more on this activity results, so you can take a look at that if you're interested. All right, I'll tell you what, I'll go till about 1:10, and then we'll take 15 minutes. All right, so it says here, any app of any complexity will include more than one activity. As your app gets more and more complex, consistent navigation becomes important. Well, if somebody is going to go and pay money to use an app that you've created, an app that has multiple activities, you better make it easy for them to peruse their way around the app. All right? And you might say, well, yeah, but they've already bought it. Yeah, but if they've already bought it, and if it's fairly popular, etc., you probably want to upgrade it over time. But if they find it too hard to work with, they're just never going to upgrade it. All right? So it says Android supports two different forms of navigation strategies for your app. Back navigation, provided by the back button and the back stack, and that's also, as it says, known as temporal navigation, and up navigation, provided by you as an option in the app bar. That's called ancestral. Now, what's the big difference? Well, by default, back will move you back up one. Ancestral, typically what will happen is if you give them the option to do that, it'll shoot you right back to whatever home is. So if you've got a fairly complex app that's got this activity that calls this one, that calls this one, that calls this one, and you're 5 or 6 deep, all right, the back one is just going to back you up through that, going through the back stack. But if you use up, typically you go right back to the main activity that started everything. Does that make sense? All right. And that's what they explain it here. They give an example. I'm not saying it's good or bad. It's totally fine. All right. Now, when they come in here and they start talking then about the other type, the up, notice over here, they got a picture here of, this is supposed to be an emulator, and they've got the button right here. All right, which typically is supposed to get you right back, all the way up the hierarchy is what they're saying. All right. Now, let's quickly go through this, and then we're taking our break. So this is the life cycle. I've already mentioned this to you. And again, you're going to see a picture very similar to what we just saw. When you start the app, as it says, the main activity is started, comes to the foreground, receives the focus. When you start a second activity, a new activity is created and started, and the main activity is stopped. When you're done with the activity 2 and you navigate back, typically by hitting the back button, activity 1 gets popped from the back stack, and it resumes. Activity 2 stops, and normally it's put on the back stack. All right? This is a LIFO type of structure. It's a last in, first out. All right? So again, they have their pictures are okay. All right? But you can read that if you're so inclined. Activity states and life cycle methods. Looks pretty similar, except the one that we saw before was a lot more vertical. This one's more horizontal. All right? They're both pretty much showing the same thing. So notice on create goes to on start, which is going to go to started, which is going to go to on resume, etc. You can see how the stuff works in here. And there's all sorts of things, so that's why you get the other arrows that are going back up again. Paused, back to resumed, stopped, back to started, etc. All right, and again, it depends on so many things. The type of thing that you're working on, what you're loading, does it have animation, what do you want to have happen if somebody is running your app and the phone rings, etc. Do you want to save everything? That type of an idea. That's what it says. It says here, depending on the complexity of your activity, you probably don't need to implement everything that's here. It is important that you understand on create. We've already talked a little bit about that. So as they mention here, your activity, it says, enters the created state when it's started for the first time. When it's first created, it calls the onCreate method to initialize the activity. All right? It says similarly, if your app starts another activity with an intent, whether it's an explicit intent or, and we'll look at this after the break, an implicit intent, it's going to call onCreate for that one too. Notice, onCreate is the only required callback you must implement. That's why it's provided for you automatically when you create the project. All right? You perform basic startup logic that should happen only once. Again, as it says there, it's a transient state. The activity remains in the onCreate only as long as it takes to run the method. All right? Then it moves on to the started state. All right? So we're going to go through this hopefully very quickly, then take our break. So it says after your activity is initialized in onCreate, it calls onStart, and the activity is in the started state. It says it's also called if a stopped activity returns to the foreground. Again, for example, when you click the back button that we talked about before. All right, and hopefully that makes sense. When an activity is in the started state and visible on screen, the user cannot interact with it until onResume is called. All right, the activity is running and the activity is in the foreground. Virtually, this stuff happens, sometimes at least on a faster machine or whatever, in a matter of seconds, maybe even milliseconds. So you don't realize it anyway. But the reason that that's important is it is possible for you to put code in any of these on methods. So if you needed to check something or whatever, all right? Make your own CAPTCHA, or if you wanted to do something like that, let's say. All right, on resume, it says your activity is in the resume state when it is initialized, visible on screen, and ready to use. It's often called the running state, because that's where, as it says, where the user is actually interacting with the app. All right. From there, it can go into the pause state. It may never go into the pause state, but it could, and it can go into the pause state many times, depending on what it is you're doing. So as it says, it can occur in several situations. The activity is going into the background, but has not been fully stopped. All right. So maybe you've got two different apps that are up and running, and you're switching back and forth between the two apps for whatever reason. Another one is what I mentioned too, that typically, you're going to see this when you go from landscape to portrait. All right? So, stop. An activity is in the stop state when it's no longer visible on the screen. So technically, even though you can put code in there, you are no longer interacting with the app. That should make sense. All right? As it says, the system calls the onStop method when the activity stops. This is where you want to put in save your persistent data. So if you had to do a database type of thing, in fact, anything that's CPU intensive, like writing to a database, when you pause this, if you needed to, the machine pauses for whatever, you don't want to write then. All right? Because you don't have a lot of control over pause. But stop, you've got more control. So anything that's considered to be CPU intensive, and with most of the time, that's either where you're doing some complex calculations, or you're writing something out to a file, or you're writing something out to a database. You want to do it in onStop. You don't want to do it in onPause. All right. Then, as it says, activity destroyed. You can read this stuff here, as to why it gets destroyed. All right. But there are different reasons. As it says, you typically use onDestroy to fully clean up your activity so that no component, such as a thread, is running after the activity is destroyed. We'll talk about threads in a later chapter. Okay? All right. Then finally, as it says, there's an onRestart. Notice again, it's a transient state that occurs only if a stopped activity is started again. All right? It is 1:10. Let's take a break. Let's come back, please, at 1:25. All right, I've mentioned this to you before, but if you haven't done so already, you really should sign up for Rankin Connection on rankin.edu. All right. Now, this morning, I got sent, what that is, this entry-level support programmer. They are starting to sprinkle in every once in a while. For a while, it was just the regular IT program. It was all hardware jobs, help support and help desk and whatever. But this one, you can read through it yourselves. I'll send this out to you, okay? But the money, is it fantastic? Well, it's a start. It's 35 to 45. It's going to depend on a lot of stuff. But it sounds like they have locations all over the place. And, again, they're looking for somebody who's got 50 different things, and you don't have all of them. But no, what do you have? Well, MySQL, SQL Server. You will have SQLite after this semester. You've got React. You've got Bootstrap. You've got JavaScript. All right. I was going to show you guys this the other day. Where is it? Of course, I don't have it now. But this medium.com that I get, they had the 10 hottest programming languages for 2022. Now, number one was Python. We go through a battle between all of us as to whether or not we should become Python-based here or not. I don't think it's going to happen, to be honest with you. All right, and some of the reasons, I don't understand, and some of them I do. But the second biggest language was JavaScript. The third biggest language, I think it was C#, and the fourth biggest one was Java. So we're doing something right. All right? Okay. Okay. So the next thing that's in here is they talk about configuration changes, and it says earlier in this section they talked about onDestroy, but they say another way that an activity can be destroyed is when the device undergoes a configuration change. This is what I mentioned before. The most common, as it says, is when the device is rotated, because basically what's got to happen, even though if it takes place in a matter of seconds or milliseconds, is it has to save everything that it had. So when it goes from one to the other, it can basically go back and repopulate itself. So as it says, when an activity is destroyed and recreated, there are implications for the runtime state of that activity. All right. When it's paused or stopped, the state is retained until that activity is held in memory. Technically, that's not even true. Maybe you've run through this. If you open up every app you've got on your system, sooner or later, some of them are going to automatically be closed by the system. So if you've got something in there that's a pig that's just taking up too much too much processing power or whatever, something like that can easily happen. All right. So they go in here on how you can save your instant state when that happens. This again would probably be something would be more important if you were doing something like with a game and you wanted to make that game available both in portrait and landscape mode. And that's what they go through in here, so I'm not really going to spend any time on it. All right, so that whole last session introduced intents, but it basically talked about explicit intents. The last 10 pages or so of this chapter will talk about implicit intents. So remember, with an implicit intent, you don't exactly say, you tell kind of what you want to have happen, but not how it should happen, for lack of better words. All right, so as it says here, in this chapter, you learn how to send and receive an implicit intent, where you declare a general action to perform and the system matches your request with an activity. All right. So it says in an earlier chapter, you learn how to start an activity from an activity by specifying the name and using the explicit intent. As mentioned, this is the way it's done most often. But there may be a reason. And again, the more generic your app is, in that if you've got an app that's going to provide a user different ways of doing the same thing, then the better the chance is that you're going to want to use an implicit intent. We're going to work in here almost totally with just explicit intents. But, if you decided you wanted to do something like that, let's just say. And let me give you an example. Nobody has ever done this here for your final project, but let's assume that one of you for your final project, what you want to do is you want to take your ePortfolio and you want to make that into an Android app. All right? I actually tried doing that, and I even bought a course on it. And the problem is that the code the guy had for the course was wrong. So I got a hold of him, and he was very nice. And he said, no, you got to do this. No, he was still wrong. So I emailed him again, and he said, what did he say? It was really a kind of a mean message. He said, stop stalking me. Well, I sent him 2 emails, and I explained to him what the problem was, and I wrote back, I said, sorry if that's what you thought. Believe me, I'll never contact you again. But I got it to somewhat work, all right? But the reason I'm telling you this is as an example. Let's just assume that you wanted to be able to bring different things up that were on there, and some of them, as an example, you might want to use GitHub. Some of them you might want to use GitHub Pages. Some of them you might want to go out and use something else. All right? And like you guys know this, we've talked about Heroku, but there's even other things in there. So what I'm telling you is, if you went and built something like that and you wanted to give the user multiple different ways of getting to something, so usually that's what this is, the implicit intent is going to involve, is you going out to the internet someplace, but you'll want to give the user multiple different alternatives as far as how they're going to get some information. That's when you typically would use the implicit intent. As it says, you don't specify the exact activity, rather you include just enough information about the task you want to perform, and then Android matches the information in your request with any activity that's available on your device. All right, maybe you've had this before where you bring up something and it says, how do you want to open this, type of an idea. That's kind of what they're getting to right here. All right. Now, I'm not going to really spend any more time on that than that. All right, I don't use implicit intents. I'm not saying they're not important. Of course they're important. Much of what you do here works the same way, but there is some stuff in here that's different. Since I've not used very much of this, I'm just going to kind of skirt my way through it. They do show you how you would send an implicit intent. All right. Again, create a new intent object, add the information such as data or extras. All right. Use the start activity, but notice you do not specify the specific activity to launch. So you wouldn't be calling it an exact class in there like we did, like I showed you with the explicit intents. All right. It says add an action or categories or both. So again, as I mentioned, if you had something like a music app, you could make that for your category, and then you could list different things in there where the system could go through and say, You can play it using this, or this, or this, or this. Some people on their phones might have several different apps to allow them to listen to music. Some might have one or two. All right? And as it says, you can even show an app chooser for the request. Bottom line is, if you're going to use this, you want to make it as simple as possible for somebody to use it. All right? And they go through all this. And here's an example of the one they use. So it says, basically, what do you want to use to open this app? All right? But like I said, not being very expert in this at all. I've read through this. I've looked at it, but I've never really used it. Okay? You'll notice in there you can set up filters, and in those filters you can put 3 pieces of information. Action. As it says, the action the activity accepts. Data. All right? It could be a URI. It can be, again, with the extras and the category if you want to put that in as well. And they explain each one of those. Okay? All right. This gets us all the way up to page 35, and it says, in the previous chapter, you learned about tasks and the backstack. All right. And it says here, the task for your app contains its own stack that contains each activity the user has visited using your app. In other words, the system has got to, for lack of better words, kind of come up with a history so that it can work its way back and forth to different pages or different activities in your app. All right, and again, they give you a picture example in here. All right. So it says, when you're working with activities, I'm up to page 37, it says you can use the activity launch modes to indicate how each new activity should be treated when launched. Now, if we had more time, I mean, think about this. We're spending a week to 2 weeks on most of this stuff. All right? I'm giving you, not the bare bones, but I'm giving you the basics. We will create an app. That app will use our put extras. All right? That app will have several activities in it. You will be given 1 or 2 programs to do that where you will have to do that. You will be given a test where you will have to do that. But then we're going to kind of move on. It's not that they go away, but it's just other things are going to be coming in, for lack of better words, kind of taking their place. All right. And that's pretty much it for this chapter. So I want to at least start getting into the next one, which is on the debugger. And we'll talk about a few things that are in here. And again, it is 1:36. I'm going to give it about 25 minutes, 25 or 30 minutes. All right, if we don't get the whole thing done, then we'll pick it up again tomorrow or Friday. I don't care. All right? But they talk about debugging. Again, running the debugger, using breakpoints, etc. Well, some of this stuff should make sense to you. For instance, I'm right here. If I come in here and I come up to right here, you've seen this before if you look on the screen. If I click here, what happened? I just set a breakpoint, right? All right? That's how I set it. That's how I remove it. Okay? And basically, it's got to be an executable line. So if I try to set it right there, all right, it did work. But if I try to set it here, or I try to set it on something that technically isn't an executable line of code, typically what will happen is it will mark it. In other words, it'll set it right there, but it'll put like a plus sign, I think it is, by it, which means that technically you can't do that here. All right. All right. You know all this stuff. Bugs can be, you can have bugs for many reasons, and they will talk about some of the bugging tools. In this particular lesson, they talk about Logcat. I haven't given Logcat its due diligence. Logcat can be a really good debugging tool. In other words, if I've got something that is not working in my program and for the life of me, I can't figure out why, in some ways, Logcat is like putting a console.log statement that we had in JavaScript. All right, not really an alert because, with an alert, it's modal. But here it just will show, and again, you hopefully have seen this already, but if I come down here and I look at these windows, there's a Logcat window right there. All right. And there are other debugging tools that are talked about in here. And they'll talk about like the support library and a few other things that are in here as well. All right. So how do you do this? I did mention this before. You may or may not have seen it or been paying attention. I don't know. But this runs your program, right? We can click here. But if we click the one that's next to it, not the grayed out ones, but the one that's next to it, as it says, that will open up your app in debug mode. All right. You can also even take an app that's running and put it into debug mode, even as it's running. All right. And that's all shown in here, and it's shown, for lack of better words, pretty much pictorially. All right. So, as it says that when you open it, let's take a look at what they're showing here. So I'm going to just run this, but I'm going to run it in debug mode. Probably should have put some code in it, but I should be able to still get this stuff up. You'll notice Logcat's going nuts because that's everything that's happening and running in the program. All right. Oh, there we go. Okay, so why does that any of that matter? Well, if we take a look, go back to the book. All right, not 2, I want 3 now. All right. It says up here we should be getting a couple different tabs. A debugger tab and a console tab is what they show here. And they show all this here. It's on page 2 of this, and when you look at it, it says there's a debug pane and there's basically a threads pane. So you can work your way through here and see different information. Now, like what? All right, I already told you quickly how you can go in and you can put in breakpoints. All right, I think it's a little easier to work with the breakpoints in here than it is in Visual Studio. You may or may not agree after you've looked at it a little bit. But like Visual Studio, you can put watches on variables in here. So you can tell the system that as the program's running, you want to see the value of variables. So, you know, if something is being changed throughout the program, you can do that. Not only that, you can basically, while the program's running, you can go in and you can change the value of one of those variables and basically just tell it to restart with the new value of the variables. All right, and that's shown in here. So it says the debugger tab has got this feature. It's got a frames tab. All right, it says it shows the frames page with the current execution stack frames for a given thread. Why is that important? If you run your program and you try to bring it up, and maybe you've seen this, if it hasn't happened to you, you just haven't written enough apps. But you try to run your app and it comes up and it immediately crashes. And you look through the code and you have no idea why that happens. The next step then would be to go through this in debug mode, all right, and find, because when you look in there in the frames tab, you can see where it blew up. And you can see what the exception was, all right? So hopefully you can do that and try to track it down that way, okay? And again, this is another LIFO type of thing, so it'll show where the program broke, what call that, what call that, what call that in a LIFO type of structure. All right. So if you don't want to use the frames, there's also a threads tab, as it says in there, where, as I just mentioned, there's a watch button and there's a variables pane. They're basically used in conjunction with one another. So as you're going through a program, you can see the value of different variables. All right. So it says, again, if the app is already running, you can start debugging. So if you open it up and just did a run, you can do a run attach debugger. All right. And they show you all the nifty little things in here to stop it, etc. Breakpoints I already mentioned. Notice, as it says there, you can choose run toggle line breakpoint or a control to clear a breakpoint. All right. What they're going to show you in just a minute is there's also a screen you can bring up to show you all your breakpoints at one time. All right. If the app is already running, I don't know if you can do this in Visual Studio or not, but even if the app's running, it says you don't need to update it. All right, so you can set a breakpoint even while the program's running. That can be important, especially if you're looping and you want to see at the end of the loop if everything worked okay. All right, you go in there and do that. You turn it on, you turn it off in the same way. That's the one I was looking for here. To view all the breakpoints, as it says, you click the View Breakpoints icon on the left edge of the debugging pane. All right, in here, and it'll show you all of them. You can turn them on and you can turn them off. All right, why is that important? Well, one thing, and this should make sense to everybody. If you've got breakpoints in a program, if you've set things, even if you've turned them, if you've disabled all of them, make sure you get rid of all breakpoints before you put something out on the App Store. You don't ever want to do that. Believe it or not, it's the same thing with toasts. You don't put an app out in the App Store that has toasts in it. All right? They can be problematic, and there can be other things and problems that they can have. What's cool about these breakpoints, in my humble opinion, is right here. You can make conditional breakpoints. So you're telling this breakpoint to only run if operand 1 is equal to 42 or if operand 2 is equal to 42. So it's not going to run all the time. All right? And they show an example of that. It says to set a breakpoint for any exception. There is an exception breakpoints, it says, in the list of different breakpoint types. And that's right here. All right? So like I said, what is going to happen, the chances are very good that sooner or later what's going to happen to all of you is there will come a time when your program is just going to, it's not going to work. And you don't know why, and that's a very fast way to find out. Notice here, too, it says you can temporarily mute a breakpoint without removing it. Why would you want to do that? Well, I want to run it. I think everything's working. I want to act like it's not there, but I want to keep that there. Now, back when I was programming, when I was sitting in your shoes, and then I went out and actually got a job as a programmer, what a lot of people did with this stuff is they used the equivalent of like a console.log or a system.out.println, and they kept all that code in there. All right, they just commented it out. But the recommendation today is that you don't do that. All right, and one reason is, and you know this, when people get into other people's code and do stuff they aren't supposed to do, a lot of times a real easy way to find things out are to look through the comments. All right, fortunately or unfortunately. All right. This stuff that's in here next, starting on page 7 here, should look familiar to you because it's very similar to what you saw in Visual Studio. In other words, notice there's a step over. As it says, it executes the next line in the code, all of the method codes on one line. So in other words, if you've got a real long routine, it'll step over it, so it'll do everything, but it'll act as though that's one big line of code. There's a step into, which as it says, basically allows you to go in and step into code where you tell it to step into. There's a step out of. Step out can be really important if you accidentally put, let's say, a breakpoint or something where you're stuck in a big loop that's going possibly millions of times. All right. The stack frames, I kind of mentioned this to you before, but as it says, it allows you to inspect the execution stack. This is, again, most often, it's a great debugging tool if your program is blowing up and you don't know why. Mentioned this already. The variables pane, as it says, allows you to inspect variables. It also allows you to evaluate expressions. It says if it's not immediately visible, there is a restore variables view button or icon that you can use for it. And they show you here on page 10 how you can actually go in and modify variables. I think that's kind of cool. All right. There's also a watch pane. All right. And it says it provides similar functionality, but it says they persist between debugging sessions. So if you know there's something that you're going to want, you're going to be working on not just today, but for several days, you might put a watch on that. And again, you're showing how to do that here. I'm not going to run through these steps. I mean, this is something, let's be honest, you're going to use it or you're never going to use it. All right, but it's the kind of thing that if you can't figure out why something isn't working any other way, this might be your only alternative, or at least your best alternative. All right, there are other tools. Again, we talked a little bit about Logcat, and I looked through this. I thought it was pretty good. This was on developer.android.com. So if you really want to know more about using Logcat, you can click on that link because they show you examples, etc., on how to use it. And there's other things too. I've never used the ADB, but I've watched people use it. Notice it's a command line tool that allows you to communicate with an emulator instance. All right. There's the profiler. A lot of these things are going to be tied to CPU usage. In other words, your program is just running like a pig and you don't understand why. All right. There's a network profiler. Since we're running on our own individual instances, that's probably not going to be something that we need to ever look at. All right. Okay, so trace logging and the Android manifest.xml file. It says there are multiple types of debugging available. Okay. You can use logging and tracing to find issues in your code when you have a trace log file. And I've never generated one of these. All right, but it's something that you can go back in and take a look. Again, as you're trying to find out why something isn't working. Now, I mentioned this earlier, but if you look here, I'm on the middle of page 13. I already said this. Remove any logging statements before you actually go to publish something. Remove toast messages. Disable any debugging you've got set, etc. All that stuff should just make sense. All right. And the next section talks about app testing. I'm just going to run through this, but I'm going to try to do it quickly. All right. There's different kinds of testing that you can set up. All right. Most of the time when I'm testing, I do what's called unit testing. So for instance, let's assume that on your next assignment, you can make, this will probably be a pretty good assumption, that what did you do on this on this homework? You created that guessing game, right? So what we'll do for the next one is you're going to add some activities to that. All right, such as you'll keep track of how many games were guessed, what the average guess was, or how many times it took you to guess, etc. And we'll, I made this little thing. You can change it if you want to. That says if you get it in 5 guesses or less, you're a pro. If you get it in 6 to 9 guesses, you're average. If it takes you more than 10 guesses, you're kind of, not going to ever get it type of an idea. All right. So what I'm saying is that basically, like with unit tests, I've got an existing product and I'm adding stuff to it and I'm testing that stuff I added to it to make sure A, it works, and B, I didn't break what was already out there. All right. It says you must make sure your app will behave the way you expect it in every situation, especially as your app grows and changes. I read this thing once where this guy said, every time you run a program, you're testing it. And I mean, I agree with that. In essence, that is what you're doing. All right. And I probably have told you about this, but just in case I haven't, I always remember this, that for years, my older brother was a comptroller, and he worked at a company. They used this weird operating system I'd never heard of before or since called PIC. And one day, one of the secretaries who was there, she reached up to grab a book, and it fell onto her computer, and she didn't think anything of it until they found out later she'd removed 3 customers from their database. Now, they backed up every day, so they were able to put it back up again, but the point is, when you say you got to test for everything, how do you test for something like that? All right, I mean, that was something that was probably a once in a lifetime type of thing that would happen. All right. Now, it says writing and running tests is a critical part of the software development process. You may or may not have ever heard of this term, TDD, test-driven development. It kind of takes testing and turns it on its head, because what test-driven development does is you write the test first before you write any code. What does that mean? The test will fail. Does that make sense? You've written a test, but there's no code there. Then you write the code and try to make the test succeed. See what I'm saying? Because like when I was doing this stuff, you'd write your code, then you'd write your design unit tests, and you test it. And what you had to do was you had to take each test and make it a page in a document, and you put down, okay, this is what the test is going to be. This is what I assume is going to happen. This is what did happen. And some of these documents were several hundred pages long because you had that many tests to make sure, again, A, that what you were trying to create worked, and B, that what you were trying to create, when you synthesized it or brought it in with other stuff, you didn't break anything. All right. The key thing here is testing your code, as it says, can help catch issues when they're early in development. All right, I've given you already that story. It's true about a guy who forgot to put a default in a switch statement, and they actually tracked the guy down. And again, no, it wasn't me. If he'd have put default break, everything would have been fine, but he didn't. And they tracked him down because that'll never happen. Well, it did, and it took New York. It took their phones down for a weekend, which just happened to be Mother's Day weekend. This was probably 30 or more years ago, and they figured they lost $5 million. All right. Again, telephony was a lot different back then, but you get the idea. How long would it would have cost nothing if when he was developing that code, if he would have just put default break. So the earlier in the process that you find errors, the cheaper they are to fix. The later, the more expensive they are to fix. That should just make sense. All right. So I've already mentioned to you kind of like unit tests. All right, as it says, they're compiled and they're run on your local machine. Okay? You test parts of the app that do not need to access the framework or the emulator, etc. You can create fake mock data, for example, to make sure stuff is working the way you want it to work. There's also instrumented tests, as it says, that run on a Android-powered device or an emulator. Now, I'm gonna guess, and I still have to go in there. We gotta test those, but I got to bring out those tablets for everybody. Why? Because what I really want to have happen is, hopefully at least, those tablets are still going to work. And before you go and put something out to the App Store, you're going to run it first on a tablet to make sure that it works on a real device. Because right now you're doing it just on an emulator. All right. So they go through a little bit on unit testing in here. I've already talked about it. And then basically the chapter just about ends with the Android testing support library. All right. And with a lot of that, what's important about that is you're talking about having stuff work with older versions of Android. And that's what they get into in here. All right. Now, I'm not doing this due diligence, I'm sure. All right. But feel free to give it a read if you think it's worth your time. All right. I think it is. All right. And again, with the support library, it's what I just mentioned. It says, in this chapter, you explore the Android support library, part of the Android SDK or software development kit tools. You use this to get backward compatible versions of new Android features, plus UI elements not included in the standard framework. So if either you want to add something you don't get by default, or you want to make sure that something is backward compatible, is what they're saying here. All right. So there's a section here on backward compatibility. Give that a read. All right. There is, they have a check in here that you can make to see if you even have. You may have the support library already included on your machine, and they have a thing in here that you can go through and double check and make sure that it's in here. And if it's not, they show you how you can add it. All right. Now, no one has said this yet, but it's not as often as it used to be, but I can't tell you the number of times when this came up like this and you were running a program and all of a sudden you'd get a message that would usually come down here that would say, a newer version of something is available, do you want to download it? All right, and sometimes it would happen daily, all right, because they were always fixing this stuff and putting bug fixes, etc. in. Doesn't seem to happen nearly as much now. When that happens, I always recommend that if you want to go and do that and download something, go ahead and do it. But always make sure you save first, all right, and if possible, get out of the program and run it when the program's not running. All right, hopefully that just makes sense to do it like that. All right. And I think that's good. So when we pick it up again on the next, so we've gone through now 1 and 2 and a little bit of 3. Oops, I want to change that. All right, so when we pick it up again, I closed the wrong one. It'll be on lesson 4, okay? And again, in lesson 4, we will look at, they call it delightful user experience, but it'll be looking at some of these controls in a lot more depth and breadth of coverage than we've done thus far. Like they'll talk about different things you can do with buttons, etc. The good news is a lot of this will be able to blaze through fairly quickly just because of the fact you've gone through how to enable and disable stuff, for example, like in C#. All right, so you know what a lot of this stuff means already. All right, so that's what I got for today. The rest of the period will be lab. All right, and tomorrow, like I said, we're going to build from scratch. We're going to build the BMI program from scratch. All right. You can turn off your things.